I never thought sXXing my boyfriend in a rented rowboat would end with local fishermen filming us and the video becoming the talk of our small Minnesota town, but here we are. I'm a 23-year-old nursing student, and this is the story of how one summer night seeking romance on the water turned into a viral moment that destroyed my clinical placement, strained my relationship with my conservative parents, and taught me that in small-town Minnesota, everyone knows everyone, and nothing stays private for long. Nick and I had been together 7 months when this happened, and those 7 months represented my first serious adult relationship after a string of disappointing college hookups and short-term flings that never went anywhere meaningful. We met at the bar where he works, not in the cliché way of him serving me drinks, but at a community fundraiser the bar was hosting for the local fire department. I was there volunteering to take blood pressure readings as part of my nursing program's community outreach requirement, and he was working the event helping coordinate activities. We started talking during a lull in the crowds, discovered we had mutual friends from high school despite having graduated different years, and by the end of the night had made plans to get coffee that weekend. What I loved about Nick from the beginning was how different he was from the pre-med and engineering students I'd mostly dated in college. He wasn't trying to climb any career ladder or prove anything to anyone. He genuinely enjoyed bartending, was good at it, made decent money, and was content with his life in our small town while I was the one with ambitions to eventually move to Minneapolis or maybe even further for better nursing opportunities. That difference in our life trajectories occasionally caused tension, but mostly it felt complementary, like we balanced each other out. He grounded me when I got too stressed about school and clinical rotations, and I pushed him to think about long-term goals beyond just the next shift at the bar. That particular evening in late July was brutally hot, the kind of Minnesota summer night where the humidity makes the air feel thick and hard to breathe even after the sun goes down. Nick had finished his shift at the bar early and texted me asking if I wanted to do something to cool off. I'd been studying for my pharmacology exam in my parents' air-conditioned basement all day and was desperate for a break and some fresh air, so I immediately said yes to whatever he had in mind. He picked me up around 9 p.m. and drove us out to Lake Winnebagoshish, one of the larger lakes in our area that's popular for fishing and recreation. When we got to the public boat launch, Nick revealed that he'd rented a small aluminum rowboat for a few hours, something he'd apparently arranged earlier in the day when planning this spontaneous date. The rental guy was packing up for the night but handed over the boat and life jackets with minimal instruction, probably assuming we were experienced enough to handle a basic rowboat on a calm evening. Nick had brought a cooler with drinks and snacks, a blanket, and a portable speaker for music, clearly having put thought into making this a romantic evening on the water. We loaded everything into the boat, put on our life jackets as required, and Nick rowed us out away from shore toward the middle of the lake where it was quieter and more private. The lake was beautiful in the fading light, that golden hour before sunset when everything looks soft and warm and perfect. There were a few other boats scattered around but mostly concentrated near the better fishing spots closer to shore, leaving the middle of the lake relatively empty and peaceful. We could hear music and voices drifting across the water from various directions but muted by distance, creating this ambient soundtrack of summer evening leisure. Nick stopped rowing once we were far enough out that the shore looked distant and small, and we just drifted for a while, drinking cold beer from the cooler and talking about nothing in particular while the boat rocked gently with the small waves. As darkness fell more completely and stars started appearing overhead, the conversation shifted from casual chit-chat to more intimate territory. Nick told me he'd been thinking about our future together, about whether I'd want him to come with me if I moved to a bigger city for work or whether that would feel like too much pressure on our relationship. I admitted I'd been wondering the same thing, worried that my career ambitions might force us to make difficult choices sooner rather than later. The honesty and vulnerability of the conversation drew us closer physically as well as emotionally, and we moved from sitting on opposite ends of the boat to being pressed together on the middle bench seat, kissing deeply while the boat continued its slow drift across the dark water. The kissing became more intense and our hands started exploring each other's bodies with growing urgency, both of us caught up in the romance and privacy of being alone together in the middle of the lake. We removed our life jackets because they were bulky and awkward and getting in the way, telling ourselves we'd put them back on before heading back to shore. We spread the blanket across the bottom of the boat and moved down from the bench seat, finding positions that worked despite the confined space and the constant gentle rocking motion of the water beneath us. We started sXXing right there in the boat under the stars, both of us too focused on each other and the physical sensations to think about practical concerns like how visible we might be or who else might be out on the water. I have no idea how long we were lost in our own world, maybe 20 minutes or maybe longer, but eventually I became aware of voices that sounded closer than the ambient background noise we'd been hearing. I lifted my head slightly and saw in the near darkness what appeared to be another boat maybe 50 yards away, close enough that I could make out the silhouettes of people in it but not close enough to see details. My first thought was that they probably couldn't see us any better than we could see them, that in the darkness we were likely just another vague shadow on the water to them. But then I noticed a light, what looked like a phone screen glowing, and the voices got louder as their boat drifted even closer to ours, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't just nearby, they'd noticed us and were specifically moving in our direction. I frantically whispered to Nick that someone was coming and we needed to get dressed immediately, both of us scrambling to find our clothes in the dark bottom of the boat while also trying to avoid tipping the whole thing over with our sudden frantic movements. The other boat was definitely approaching us now, and I could hear male voices making comments and laughing, clearly having figured out what we'd been doing and finding it hilarious. Nick was trying to pull his shirt on while also trying to position himself to block their view of me, and I was desperately trying to get my clothes back on while also grabbing the blanket to cover myself with whatever I could manage. By the time we were minimally decent, the other boat had pulled up alongside ours close enough that I could see it held 3 men who looked to be in their 40s or 50s, clearly local fishermen based on all the equipment in their boat. They were grinning at us with that particular Minnesota passive-aggressive amusement, not quite mocking but definitely entertained by our situation. One of them made some comment about the lake being a popular spot for all kinds of recreation, and the others laughed like this was the funniest thing they'd heard all week. I noticed with absolute dread that one of them was holding up his phone aimed directly at us, the screen recording light clearly visible even in the darkness. Nick tried to laugh it off and make some joke about just enjoying the nice weather, but his voice came out strained and defensive. The fisherman made a few more pointed comments about making sure to check if life jackets were required and to be careful about boat safety, all delivered with that tone of elderly locals scolding foolish young people while also finding the whole situation deeply amusing. Then they finally rowed away still chuckling among themselves, and Nick and I were left sitting in our boat in mortified silence, both of us processing what had just happened and what it might mean. Nick wanted to row back to shore immediately and get out of there, but I insisted we needed to stay out longer so it wouldn't look like we were fleeing in shame, though honestly I'm not sure what difference that made given they'd already filmed us. We sat in awkward silence for another 30 minutes or so, neither of us able to recapture any of the romantic mood from earlier, both just counting down time until it seemed reasonable to head back. The ride back to shore was quiet except for the sound of the oars in the water, and we returned the boat to the rental place without talking much, both lost in our own anxious thoughts about those fishermen and what they might do with that video. I didn't sleep that night, lying in my childhood bedroom in my parents' house just replaying the scene over and over, imagining worst-case scenarios about where that video might end up. Minnesota is a small state in many ways, with tight-knit communities especially in the more rural areas, and I knew from experience how fast gossip could spread through overlapping social networks. Nick texted me around 2 a.m. saying he couldn't sleep either, that he was really sorry for suggesting the boat in the first place, that he hoped this wouldn't cause me problems. I appreciated the apology, but it didn't make me feel any better about the situation. My worst fears were confirmed the next afternoon when my best friend from nursing school sent me a text asking if I'd been out on Lake Winnie last night because there was a video going around that looked a lot like me and Nick. My heart dropped into my stomach as I asked her to send me the link, and there it was in a local community Facebook group called Life in Northern Minnesota, grainy phone video of two people, very obviously me and Nick, in a boat in various states of undress, with a caption making some joke about summer romance on the lake. The video had been posted maybe 6 hours earlier and already had over 200 reactions and 90 comments, with people tagging their friends and making jokes and, most horrifyingly, some people correctly identifying us by name. I spent the rest of that day in a state of panic, watching the video spread across multiple local Facebook groups and seeing my name and Nick's name mentioned more and more frequently in the comments. Some people were defending us, saying it was a private moment and shouldn't have been filmed, but many more were treating it as hilarious small-town gossip, the kind of story that would get told and retold for years at community events. I saw comments from people I'd gone to high school with, from parents of kids I used to babysit, from members of my church, all of them now aware of this extremely private moment that had been captured and broadcast to essentially everyone I'd ever known. The professional consequences hit faster than I'd anticipated. Monday morning I got a call from my clinical supervisor at the hospital where I was doing my nursing rotation, asking me to come in for a meeting before my scheduled shift. When I arrived, she sat me down with the hospital's HR representative and explained that they'd received complaints from several staff members about a video circulating on social media featuring me in a compromising situation, and while it hadn't occurred on hospital property or involved any HIPAA violations, they were concerned about whether it reflected the professional standards they expected from their clinical students. They didn't terminate my placement outright but made it clear I was on thin ice, that any further incidents or concerns about my judgment would result in me losing the placement I needed to complete my degree. My parents found out the same day through their own social networks, and the conversation with them was one of the worst experiences of my life. My mother cried, asking how I could be so reckless and careless about my reputation. My father barely spoke to me for days, and both of them made it clear they were deeply disappointed and embarrassed by my behavior. They're conservative religious people who raised me to value modesty and propriety, and this very public display of sexuality was basically their worst nightmare for their daughter. The fact that I was an adult in a consensual relationship didn't matter to them. I'd brought shame to the family name in their eyes. The small-town social consequences were relentless in ways that would never happen in a bigger city. I couldn't go to the grocery store without feeling like everyone was looking at me and whispering. People I barely knew would make pointed comments about lake safety or boat rentals when they saw me. My younger sister, who was still in high school, got teased about it by her classmates, which made me feel even worse because my actions had affected her social standing through no fault of her own. The nursing student group chat that had been friendly and supportive became awkward and strained, with some classmates clearly uncomfortable around me after seeing the video. Nick and I went through a really rough patch in our relationship during those first few weeks after the video. He felt guilty for suggesting the boat in the first place and for not being more careful about our surroundings, but he also dealt with it by trying to brush it off and make jokes about it, which infuriated me because I was dealing with much more serious consequences than he was. His reputation as a bartender wasn't really affected. If anything, some of his regulars thought it made him more of a legend, while my carefully constructed professional image as a serious nursing student had been thoroughly demolished. We fought about his lack of understanding for what I was going through, about whether he'd deliberately chosen a risky location because he enjoyed the danger, about whether we had a future together given how differently we approached life. About a month after the video first appeared, I hit rock bottom emotionally, seriously considering dropping out of nursing school and just leaving town entirely to start over somewhere where nobody knew about my most embarrassing moment. I was having panic attacks before clinical shifts, worrying that patients or their families would recognize me from the video. I'd stopped going to any social events to avoid the looks and comments, and I was seriously depressed about how one stupid decision had derailed the career path I'd worked so hard toward. My best friend finally convinced me to talk to a therapist, and that probably saved me from making an impulsive decision I would have regretted. The therapist helped me work through the shame and humiliation, helped me separate my worth as a person and as a future nurse from this one mistake, helped me develop coping strategies for dealing with the ongoing social fallout. She also helped me and Nick work on our communication in couples sessions, figuring out how we could support each other better and whether we wanted to stay together given everything that had happened. We decided to keep trying, to work through it together rather than letting this incident destroy our relationship on top of everything else it had already damaged. 6 months later, the video had mostly stopped circulating actively, though it still existed out there in the digital archives and would probably surface periodically forever. I'd made it through my clinical rotation despite the rocky start and was back in good standing with my program, though I was hyper-conscious about maintaining an extremely professional image to counteract the video's damage. My relationship with my parents had slowly started to repair as they saw me taking responsibility and working hard to move past the mistake. Nick and I were still together and had actually grown closer through the process of working through this crisis together, though we both agreed we'd never do anything remotely risky or public again. Looking back now almost a year later, I can see how that night on the lake fundamentally changed my approach to risk, privacy, and the consequences of impulsive decisions. I learned that in the age of smartphones nothing is truly private if you're in a semi-public place, that small-town social dynamics can amplify embarrassment beyond anything you'd experience in a city, and that professional reputation takes years to build but can be damaged in seconds. I learned that some moments of spontaneity carry costs that far outweigh whatever pleasure or excitement they provide in the moment. Most painfully, I learned that women face far harsher judgment than men for sexual behavior, that my mistake affected my career and family relationships in ways that Nick's didn't affect his, and that's a harsh reality I'll carry forward into how I navigate the world as a healthcare professional. The lake taught me all of these lessons the hard way, and while I've survived and moved forward, I'll never forget what it cost me or how differently that night could have ended if those fishermen had just minded their own business and kept rowing.